when we think about what are some of the great challenges moving forward, I think we have to consider what are the real barriers to a kind of healthy, diverse society. And by that, I mean a society as well as schools in which we can live, learn, and work together in a multi-ethnic democracy. And those barriers are immigration and demographic shifts, religious diversity, I think resentment of ethnic minorities, and multi-ethnic democratic participation. And we think about the challenges of religious diversity, and they really are being highlighted in current attitudes as well as in political campaigns. We're seeing proposals to ban immigrants based on religious faith. The attitudes regarding Syrian refugees and Muslims. We're not only seeing this by some of our most important, or at least most well-known political leaders, both in the Congress as well as in campaigns for the presidency, but we're seeing this in the American majority. Vast numbers of Americans have negative attitudes toward not only immigrants who are Muslim, but also calls for Muslim Americans to be targeted by law enforcement. And so we're seeing an extreme reaction to religious diversity, the rise of Islamophobia in our schools. The research on that shows that children are now suffering from Islamophobia at our K-12 level. They are being attacked and abused. And we learned from recent data-driven reports that approximately 55% of Americans voice unfavorable opinions of Islam. That's going to be a real test because religious diversity is critical. It's critical to who we are as a nation. And it's going to be one of the important questions as to how we're able to make a democracy work. The other thing we're saying is an age-old question, but we're saying this probably at a much more intense level than in recent years, and that is resentment of ethnic minorities. The political divides in the current campaigns have raised central question as to whether conservative voters and what is called the alt-right segments of the population, meaning the extreme right nationalist segment of the population, whether they are motivated mainly by economic anxiety or racial anxiety. And there have been a number of studies to test this. I think what we've discovered is that they're motivated by both, but it's also apparent that when you pair economic anxiety with racial anxiety, that actually motivates a much larger segment of the population to take one political position or another. So there's ample evidence that racial isolation and resentment are strongly predictive of conservative views in America, and it has reached or spread to a very significant portion of the population. So it's going to be difficult to have healthy, diverse schools as well as a society that works with growing resentment of minorities. And that is something that we're going to have to work on in schools and out of schools as well. Conservative voters have stated again and again in surveys that they're more likely to view African Americans and other minority groups negatively. That's a challenge going forward that that's going to be really, really tough for us to resolve. The other one for a healthy society is the fear of multi-ethnic democratic participation. One of the responses to what Pew Center called the Next America is that more and more Americans have decided that participation in a democratic society should be restricted in ways that many voters are disenfranchised or their efforts to vote have been impeded. Now, as of 2011, for example, 38 states introduced legislation to constrain and obstruct universal suffrage. Now, the claim has been that all of these voter ID laws, changing the voting dates, modifying early voting, limiting the places at which you can vote, are all designed to counter what is called voter fraud. We do have studies on that, and the most well-known study looked at 1 billion votes between 2000 and 2014 and found only 31 cases of voter fraud. So we don't really have any kind of systematic or even a significant practice of voter fraud in America. In fact, they say that voter fraud is almost equivalent to alien abduction. And so that is not the reason. The state campaigns to impede voters reflect a fear and resentment of a multi-ethnic democratic society. And so therefore there have been strategic efforts to target and discriminate against certain segments of the voting population. One example of this was the voter ID law that was considered in North Carolina, and the federal court looked at it. And the federal court concluded that the primary purpose was not to stop voter fraud, but rather to disenfranchise minority voters. And the judges actually said that African-American voters in North Carolina were targeted with almost surgical precision. And so here is a real challenge going forward. We are a democratic society. The solidarity, the health of a democratic society depends on all segments of the population having an equal right to participate in the body politic. And so efforts and ongoing efforts to disenfranchise voters based upon minority status, based upon religious status, based up even on the status of youth is a real challenge going forward, and one that we are going to have to really confront and eliminate from a democratic society. We now have some evidence as to the percent of the populations that are disenfranchised just based on the voter IDs that are required. And so for African Americans, about 25%, but it's also 20% for Asians and 19% for Latinos. Young people are more likely to be disenfranchised as well as seniors. So these ID laws do not create a healthy democratic society. Rather, they disenfranchise significant proportions of the population. And that creates a lot of hostility and a lot of anger. And it also creates a society that is much more unequal as well as unjust.